one of the recommendations, and certainly one of the things that arose out of the Marshal Inquiry, was that the Public Prosecution Service was separated out from the Department of Justice and became Canada's first independent public prosecution service in order to shield it from political influence and the like. That was seen as one of the solutions to some of the problems that existed, but in my view, the Public Prosecution Service didn't use that independence to aggressively address the systemic racism that existed in prosecutorial and policing practices. In fact, it might be said that they kind of used their independence to resist the shift towards diversity, equity, and inclusion that we've seen in most government and public systems over the last 30 years. I would say that the Public Prosecution Service over the last 4 or 5 years has been under tremendous external pressure to address the systemic racism that exists in PPS, and that Martin Hirschhorn's development of the fair treatment policies and statements was in response to that pressure. I think that that's important to say, because I do not believe, and this is just my opinion, but from my position I would say that PPS has been proactively adopting and advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion, and certainly not anti-racism in its operations. And again, I'd say I'm not a legal practitioner, but from my read of the policy, what I would say is the strongest value of the policy is that it acknowledges this problem with systemic racism and the need for PPS to have a lens on their work that is proactively addressing systemic racism and ensuring that the practice at PPS is designed to spot systemic racism and the over-prosecution and the over-adjudication of Black people, and to use tools that are the discretionary tools at PPS to advance equity and fairness in public prosecution. From my read of the policy, what I would say is the strongest value of the policy is that it acknowledges this problem with systemic racism and the need for PPS to have a lens on their work that is proactively addressing systemic racism and ensuring that the practice at PPS is designed to spot systemic racism and the over-prosecution and the over-adjudication of Black people, and to use tools that are the discretionary tools at PPS to advance equity and fairness in public prosecution. The fair treatment policy begins to lay out practices to support PPS and its employees in understanding how to address the systemic racism. So, for example, the policy describes how the Public Prosecution Service should use alternative measures for adjudication how to properly use its discretion at various stages in the public prosecution process. So for example, at arraignment and at bail, and when giving direction to police and things like that are highly technical, that in terms of the work that's going on there. But one of the things that's in the policy is the idea that the equity committee within the PPS can be a place where prosecutors can bring cases where black folk are being adjudicated to review the case with the committee to say, hey, what are some of my options in this file, so that prosecutors can be supported and even supported in their considerations of how to properly adjudicate situations in which race is a factor. What of the weaknesses in the policies? Whenever you have a policy that establishes a process that may be used rather than must be used, then you're opening up the door to discretion that can be used perhaps in an ill-informed way, or in a way that isn't as informed about the nature of anti-black racism as we might like. I really don't think that at this stage that tweaking the policy is the issue. I think the idea that the Public Prosecution Service has this policy and acknowledges the nature of anti-black racism and systemic racism in the public prosecution work is a tremendous advancement. Having an equity committee that has a job of helping their colleagues to bring that policy to life, fantastic. The idea that the Public Prosecution Service now has a senior individual at the executive table whose job is to continue to advise and inform the executive around issues of equity and inclusion and anti-racism, fantastic. I think for me, the issue now is for us to see that policy alive and in action. And organizations like the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute, who are lawyers who are representing black people out there in real time, will be able to use that policy when negotiating and discussing cases with prosecutors. And in time, we will see whether or not the policy is making the change that we had all hoped for. So I think that for me, I'm in a state of let's wait and see. Let's see how the policy is implemented. Could it be improved? Absolutely, it could be improved. But I'm less concerned about the minutiae in the policy at this point, and more concerned about how Public Prosecution Service embraces this acknowledgement and this way of practicing differently. There are two things, I guess, that really concern me currently in the Public Prosecution Service. People need to understand that systemic racism at the Public Prosecution Service doesn't simply exist because Robert Wright says it exists, right? The Marshal Inquiry made it clear that it existed. And there have been internal rumblings at Public Prosecution Service for the entirety of its existence as an independent organization since 1990, that black and indigenous people weren't being able to advance within the Public Prosecution Service. So there had been concerns, not just about how the Public Prosecution Service adjudicates or prosecutes black people, but also how they hire and treat the people that work in the Public Prosecution Service. So up until fairly recently, there had never been a black or indigenous person in a managing role as a lawyer in Public Prosecution Service or at the executive table of the Public Prosecution Service.
And what's the executive table?
Well, that would be the senior leaders of the director, the deputy director, the senior folk who actually run the Public Prosecution Service.
But what do they do? Because they don't prosecute cases themselves, do they? What do they do day to day?
Well, they manage and give direction to the Public Prosecution Service.
Okay.
Right. So, for example,
A wide number of things.
Yeah. So, like every organization has a senior administration, and there has been no racial diversity at the senior administration in the Public Prosecution Service until fairly recently. I think David Curry was the first person to be appointed to a managing role. If we look at organizations in the public sector in North America today, there is a recognition that if we are going to have, if we're going to address the systemic racism that exists in our society, that our public institutions need to have representation of diverse individuals at the highest level of organizations. I noticed that Dalhousie University just appointed a provost and academic vice president who is a black woman. As an example, there is a recognition that institutions, if they want to develop their capacity to truly serve the whole population, they're going to need to have people in senior administration who understand the needs of a diversity of people. And so the PPS has not done that until just a half minute ago, if you will.
And you said David Curry, what is his role in the...
I think he's a managing lawyer at PPS in his region.
Roughly how many managing lawyers do you think there are?
Oh, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know, but I would say that in each region there would be a managing lawyer, and I don't know how many regions the PPS would have. So I wouldn't even have.
So there's still a number of regions that still don't have diversity.
Yes. I mean, yes. I mean, yes. He's the only one, to my knowledge. So. So the two things. Number one is having folk in leadership at PPS who have a commitment to diversity and a role to continue to support PPS in its evolution in that regard. As we mentioned, Angela Johnson had served was drafted from the Public Service Commission to come into PPS to serve as a senior advisor in that regard. But she has since left.
I was just going to say, I understand she's since left. Is there been a replacement? Does that role require on paper, I guess, a person of color to be in the role? Or maybe you don't know.
I would imagine that such a role ought to be designated, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure the reasons for her leaving, and I'm not sure what the process is for her replacement, or if there is an intention to replace her.
But you can't say she hasn't been replaced as of yet.
I do not believe she has been replaced as of the taping today. So I'm concerned about that. Anyone who has been tracking PPS, who knows that in its history there has been this problem of systemic racism, who understands that the fair treatment of Indigenous persons and fair treatment of African Nova Scotians policies were implemented due to external pressures on the Public Prosecution Service to improve its game. Anyone who has been tracking the fact that the fair treatment of African Nova Scotians policy was not universally embraced, but that there was a tremendous kind of turmoil in its implementation initially, for sure. Anybody who knows that the Public Service Commission actually commissioned a study of systemic racist hiring practices at PPS, a report that has been not released to the public and that has not been released even to us at ANSJI, even though we FOI-popped it. Anyone who's watching and sees an individual, a senior individual from the Public Service Commission, go into the Public Prosecution Service and serve only a brief period of time before leaving in a senior role advising around equity, anyone who sees these things should be concerned, right? And so I'm concerned about that, about the lack of filling that role and the outstanding documented concerns around systemic racism in PPS with no one now responsible for unpacking that. That's my first concern.
Oh, honey, we're about to get very busy up in here.